I always knew that Hitler's empire occupied great areas of land and many countries at its height, but I always wondered what countries endured that occupation the longest. I determined all the countries occupied by the Nazis during World War II, and then estimated the length of time that each country endured that occupation, and it was not easy, because many variables are debatable. Also, to make things clear, I use the term liberation loosely. Many European countries were liberated from the Nazis only to be reoccupied by Soviet Russia. So, when I say liberate, I do specifically mean freed from Hitler's control. I'll explain my logic in each answer to determine which countries endured the longest Nazi occupation. Number 12. Yugoslavia. April the 17th, 1941 would mark the first day of occupation in Yugoslavia when the Royal Yugoslav Army surrendered to Axis forces. However, determining the day in which Yugoslavia became liberated is not an easy one. Yugoslavia would essentially be the bane of Hitler's existence. Partisan forces held liberated territories scattered across the country, and they would put up a stiff fight requiring the attention of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers that Hitler desperately needed elsewhere. Now, eastern areas of Yugoslavia were liberated by partisan and Soviet forces piece by piece as the war progressed. A very significant moment for Yugoslav liberation was March 8, 1945, when a coalition Yugoslav government was formed in Belgrade with Tito as premier. Then later, on March 8, 1945, German Army Group E surrendered to the Western Allies. However, Army Group E still had to march to British lines in Austria, which at the time of the surrender was still several days away. So, despite the war being officially over, sporadic fighting would continue between Yugoslav partisans and a mixture of Croatian and German forces until the end of May 1945, culminating in the Battle of Odjak, what's become known as the last battle of the European theater in World War II. To me, the culmination of this battle is the official end of the fighting and the complete liberation of Yugoslavia in World War II. Estimated occupation time, April the 17th, 1941 until May the 25th, 1945. 4 years, 1 month, and 8 days. Number 11. France. The Battle of France was the worst defeat for the Allies in World War II, and it gave Nazi Germany the resources it needed to invade the Soviet Union. France endured a brutal occupation that began on June 22, 1940, marked by the armistice signing with Germany. Now, when it comes to liberation, parts of Normandy, France would become liberated following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, and many more areas of southern France would also become liberated with Operation Dragoon on August 15th. Paris was liberated on August 25th, and by October 1944, most of French land had been recaptured. Significant fighting would continue in port cities such as Dunkirk until the German surrender in May. Many people considered the liberation of Paris to be the essential liberation of France. So, how does one determine when France was actually liberated? To me, the Colmar Pocket Campaign was the last major battle on French land, and soon after, German forces were pushed east of the Rhine. Therefore, to me, even though German forces held port cities and offered resistance in those ports until the very end, the majority of fighting in France and majority of French land was liberated with the end of the Colmar Pocket Campaign on February 9, 1945. Total occupation time, June 22, 1940 to February 9, 1945. 4 years, 7 months, and 18 days. If you believe that France was not completely liberated until the end of the war, then occupation time would actually be 4 years, 10 months, and 17 days. Number 10. Belgium. Belgium would be one of the first countries Nazi Germany attacked in the West, and on May 28, 1940, Belgium surrendered to German forces. Belgium would see heavy fighting between September and October 1944 and would become mostly liberated. However, southern Belgium would become heavily reoccupied by German forces in the Battle of the Bulge and would not push German forces out of the country until February 4, 1945. Total occupation time, 4 years, 8 months, and 7 days. Number 9. Luxembourg. Luxembourg was invaded by German forces on May 10, 1940, and quickly captured. The length of occupation is hard to say. Allied forces entered Luxembourg City on September 10, 1944. In November 1944, Waffen-SS troops would attack the town of Vianden in what would be known today as the most important battle for the resistance of Luxembourg. However, northern Luxembourg would later become heavily reoccupied when German forces would slice through the country as part of the Battle of the Bulge. Allied counterattacks would eventually recapture the link between Belgium and Luxembourg on January 28th and would not see complete liberation until around a week later in early February, when the remaining German forces from the Bulge battle were finally forced out. Luxembourg City would continue to be bombed by German V-3 cannons in February as well, but the city would not fall back into Nazi hands. Total occupation time: May the 10th, 1940 until February 4th, 1945. 4 years, 8 months, and 25 days. Number 8. The British Channel Islands. The Channel Islands are crown dependencies, but at the same time are not part of the United Kingdom. They are self-governing, but the bottom line is, they are not exactly their own countries. But, considering the unique story of occupation they endured during the war, and out of respect, I decided to place them on this list. The Bailiwick Islands of Guernsey and Jersey were occupied quite fast after the fall of France. What began as a rather peaceful occupation turned into very harsh times as the years of occupation went on. German occupiers used forced labor to create defenses for the islands. After the liberation of France, supply lines to the islands were completely cut off, meaning that all inhabitants of the islands faced starvation until relief was sent by the Red Cross in December of 1944. The islands were liberated with the German garrison surrender on May 9, 1945. German troops were removed from the islands between May 9th and May 20th. Total occupation time: June 30th, 1940 until May 9th, 1945. 4 years, 10 months, and 9 days. Number 7. Norway. Armed resistance against the invading German forces ended on June 10, 1940. Norway would be held by German forces until the German surrender in May. Some German commanders even thought that Norway may serve as a last bastion of German defense for the Third Reich, but it was not to be. Total occupation time: June 10, 1940 until the 8th of May, 1945. 4 years, 10 months, 28 days. Number 6. The Netherlands. On May 14, 1940, the Netherlands were invaded by German forces, and part of the Netherlands were liberated as the war progressed into 1944 and 1945. But northern and western parts of the Netherlands would remain in German hands until capitulation on May 5, 1945. Estimated occupation time: May 14th to 1940 until May 5th, 1945. 4 years, 11 months, and 21 days. Number 5. Denmark. After some fighting, Denmark surrendered to German forces within mere hours of invasion. The king and government of Denmark would continue to function until August 29, 1943, when it was placed under direct military occupation, all the way until the Allied victory. Estimated occupation time: April 9, 1940 until May 5, 1945. 5 years and 26 days. Number 4. Poland. German forces invaded Poland from the north, south, and west of the country on September 1, 1939, marking the start of World War II in Europe. Using blitzkrieg tactics, Poland was occupied very quickly. Russia also invaded Poland on September 17th, and by October 6th, Poland was defeated. After the German invasion of Russia, the Russian-held area of Poland also fell into German hands and would remain that way until mid-January 1944, when parts of Poland began to become liberated with Soviet advances south. By February 1945, most of Poland was liberated from Nazi control, with just some areas north, such as Danzig, and south still in German hands. The liberation of Poland is hard to estimate. Poland saw bitter fighting and a slow liberation that lasted over the time span of a year. Different parts of Poland saw occupation between September 1st, 1939 and May 7th, 1945. Even so, it's hard to determine estimate because many German units in the Danzig area continued to fight even after the German official surrender in order to escape from the Russians by sea. It's also hard to estimate because Poland would become reoccupied by Soviet Russia. Some would debate that this was not a liberation at all. Because the fighting was so severe, I believe that Poland did not see complete liberation until the very end of the war. Estimated occupation time, October 6, 1939 until May 7, 1945. 5 years, 7 months, and 1 day. Number 3. Czechoslovakia. As stated in the Munich Agreement, Nazi Germany was allowed to occupy the Sudetenland. This began on October 1, 1938, but Hitler used the confusion and a weakened Czechoslovakia to occupy the whole country by March 15, 1939. By the beginning of November 1944, eastern parts of Hitler's Slovak state were being liberated slowly by the Red Army. However, the westernmost part of Czechoslovakia, including Prague, would not be liberated until the very end of the war. In fact, the Prague offensive would continue even after the full capitulation of Germany on the 8th of May 1945. The surrounding of Army Group Center and the Prague offensive would not be completed until May 11, 1945. Estimated occupation time, March 15, 1939 until May the 11th, 1945. 6 years, 1 month, and 26 days. Number 2. Austria. Austria's occupation began with Anschluss on March 12, 1938. By March 15th, the Nazis arrested over 70,000 people and Hitler delivered a speech in Vienna, essentially completing his occupation. The annexation by German forces began to see liberation with the Russian Vienna offensive, but most of Austria would not see full liberation until the official German surrender on May 7, 1945. Estimated occupation time, March 12, 1938 until May 7, 1945. 7 years, 1 month, and 25 days. Number 1. Germany itself. What a lot of people don't consider is Germany having endured the longest Nazi occupation. Not every German citizen supported or wanted Hitler as a leader. Millions fell victim to the decisions of the Nazi Party. Many were murdered in death camps, human rights were violated, and the history itself has left a hurtful legacy that continues to pain the German citizens even to this day. Hitler was elected Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Dachau concentration camp opens only 2 months later on March 22nd, and only 1 day later, Hitler used the Enabling Act to grant himself full dictatorial power, and Nazi Germany was born. Parts of Germany are liberated by Russia and the Western Allies as early as 1944, marked by the Battle of Aachen. Even as his empire collapses around him, Hitler holds tight control over his remaining territories. By May 7th, Hitler has already been dead for a week, but the Nazis are essentially still in power with full military discipline until the official surrender. SS troops will continue to fight in isolated battles, but the Nazis essentially no longer have power by May the 8th. The birth of Nazi Germany, March 23, 1933, until May the 7th, 1945. 12 years, 1 month, and 14 days. I hope you have enjoyed this video. This movie was a passion project of mine because I always wondered how long each occupied country was occupied by the Nazis, and the results have astounded me. So many countries endured such hard times, and most on this list for over half a decade, or more. Now that you've watched this video, let us all give thanks to the men and women who sacrificed their lives and more in order to restore freedom to the countries listed. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video.